I'm Catherine Lawrence. I work for Santhera Pharmaceuticals as a medical advisor across the UK and Ireland, and kindly been invited to do this presentation alongside Janet Bloor, who's a parent of a child with Duchenne, well, an adult with Duchenne muscular dystrophy. What we'd like to do in this talk is take you through the drug treatment, through Idebenone, give you a little bit of understanding on the history, how it's been repurposed, why it's been repurposed, and the science behind that. And I'll do that very briefly before then handing over to Janet, who will give you the patient and the parent's perspective on how this repurposing is working. Okay. So very quickly, just to introduce a little bit about Santhera Pharmaceuticals. So we're a very small pharmaceutical company. We only actually formed about 14 years ago, and specialise in bringing products to the market that work in mitochondrial diseases and more recently in neuromuscular diseases. The treatment we're talking about today, the generic name is Idebenone. It was actually initially developed by another pharmaceutical company. They initially researched on it for Alzheimer's disease and then went on actually to license it for another rare disease called Friedreich's ataxia. Post that, Santhera took on board the molecule and actually developed it initially under the trade name Raxone for a very rare optic neurology disease called Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy. And it currently still holds the license for that. But before I go into talking about it in relation to Duchenne muscular dystrophy, I just wanted to take you through a little bit of the science so you can understand, firstly, how the product works for the mitochondrial diseases, but then how that actually translates into the repurposing for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. So I will do a very brief overview of mitochondria and their function. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into too much science. I'll try and keep it top level. But in principle, the mitochondria are the powerhouses of your cells. They're there to predominantly produce energy so that cells within your body can function in the way that they're meant to function. And they do that in the way of forming energy in the form of ATP. They do have some other secondary functions that are very important, such as detoxifying the reactive oxygen species, so preventing inflammation. And also, I think one of the most important things for understanding how it works in the diseases we've worked on is they have a role to play in terms of preventing cell death. So sorry, this is a little bit of a complicated slide, but I just wanted to take you through the process of energy production in a little bit more detail because it helps you understand how Idebenone works in both diseases. So very simply, within the mitochondria, you have 5 different complexes, and what happens is electrons enter into the mitochondria and they're passed through these complexes and it forms an energy gradient which allows the mitochondria to produce ATP, which gives the energy to the cells. If you have impaired mitochondria, you can't transport the electrons down the electron gradient, so you get reduced ATP production, reduced energy. You also get an increase in reactive oxygen species, which can be damaging to the cell, and those two things together can actually go on to trigger cell death. So how does Idebenone work? So to all intents and purposes, Idebenone is actually just an electron carrier, and it's an electron carrier that can enter into the mitochondria and have its direct action on the mitochondria. So if a patient takes Idebenone, when you have impaired mitochondrial function, it can act as the electron carrier, taking the electrons to where they need to go through to create that energy that the cell needs to produce. In doing that, it will also reduce the reactive oxygen species, so reduce the inflammation. So just want to take a couple of slides to have a look at how that then actually works within the diseases that we're looking at. So firstly, if we look at the Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, so that's the disease that Idebenone or Raxone currently has a marketing authorization for, so a license for. So in Leber's hereditary optic neuropathy, patients actually have a mutation in the mitochondrial DNA, which means that their electron transport chain is damaged and doesn't work properly. So the logic says that if you take Idebenone, you can reactivate that transport system and you'll allow the mitochondria to continue to function. In the patients with LHON where they have the impaired mitochondrial function, this actually goes on to create inflammation within the retinal ganglion cells in the eye, and actually ultimately causes retinal ganglion cell death. And so patients get very sudden onset of vision loss, often sort of late teenage years, early adulthood. But then how does that translate into Duchenne muscular dystrophy? So there's some in vitro studies that have looked at secondary causes of some of the symptoms of Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And one of those in vitro studies was looking at the role of mitochondrial dysfunction. So in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the predominant problem is that these predominantly boys, it can happen in some females, but predominantly boys, have a loss of the dystrophin protein. And that leads to muscle degeneration and loss of muscle function. However, it's thought that there's also a secondary effect in terms of the role of the mitochondria. So when you have a loss of dystrophin protein, that destabilizes cell membranes and muscle cell membranes. And that can lead to an influx of calcium into the mitochondria, which causes mitochondrial damage. So the in vitro studies have looked at, well, does that mitochondrial damage cause muscle cell death? And they've shown that, yes, it does. So in the same way as with the LHON, you get the increased reactive oxygen species, you get the reduced energy, and you get the initiation of muscle cell death, contributing towards the muscle degeneration. So our company took on board the information from those in vitro studies and applied the logic and applied the theory that, well, if you gave Idebenone, could you also, in Duchenne muscular dystrophy, help prevent that cell death and help prevent the muscle degeneration? And so what that's led to is a clinical trial development program for Duchenne muscular dystrophy. Because we already had a lot of the information in terms of preclinical data, safety data from the previous disease areas with which Idebenone had been studied, we were able to go straight into phase 2. So we started it with a phase 2 study, the Delphi study. That initially looked actually at cardiovascular outcomes because we had data from previous disease areas that potentially it would work on cardiac function. However, that didn't achieve its primary endpoint, but we had a signal in terms of respiratory function decline, so we used that to design the phase 3 study, the DELOS study, with the continuation study, the CIRROS, with long-term follow-up. We also have an ongoing study recruiting, look at a slightly different Duchenne muscular dystrophy population, the CIRROS study, and we have a phase 4 study planned. We're currently sort of at this point here in between these two studies where we're preparing to apply for marketing authorization now. So I'm going to hand over to Janet now, where she'll give you obviously the patient and the parent perspective on this.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm not going to do any slides. I think Catherine's done a brilliant point of view with the science. I'm going to just talk from a parent-carer point of view. My son is 25, and he was diagnosed late at 9. They got it all wrong. They thought it was Becker's. It wasn't. But anyhow, what I'm saying is, at that time, there was no hope, no cure. Dead by 20. That's what I was told. And to be honest, it's taken this long for a company like Santhera to address the great unmet need of the non-ambulatory older population. Because quite frankly, because of better standards of care, we suddenly have a growing tribe of adult Duchenne men. No one saw that. So although there's over 50 trials all over the world for Duchenne's and Becker's, this was the first one to look at adults. And I can't tell you how happy I am about that, because I've, been in around DMD for a long time, and I've fought for Translarna. My son and I have been to the FDA in Washington. We've been all over. We've just come back from Rome for PPMD. So we are the best experts in our disease. And I can tell you there's a massive unmet. And the whole point about Santhera addressing this, it just changes the whole dynamics of what is available for young men. And it is mostly young men. It's 1 in 3,500 boys that get it, because it's on the X chromosome, and girls have 2, so they're mostly protected. But, they are rarer than rare. It's 1 in 50 million. And I'm not a carrier. You can be. So I have complete spontaneous mutation with Philip. So But then you think mitochondria, that is, as Catherine put it better than me, the power behind the batteries of your cells. And if it's looking at respiratory problems, I have an inkling it's going to help the heart as well. That's what I think. And, you know, the other diseases, ataxia, it's mitochondrial. There's so many things out there. And to come now to talk about the actual clinical trial that Philip's on, he's on the Sidrus trial. As Catherine explained, the Dallas trial was for boys that went on, young men that went on steroids. Then Sidrus was for the young men on steroids. So it's not an onerous trial. It was 18 months for the trial, which is now completed. He's now on the extension trial, so I know for sure he's getting Raxone. But I have a sneaking suspicion, as patient number 1 in Queen's Square, it'd been rotten luck to be on a placebo. And also, I have other thoughts on this. It's because we have a home FVC monitor. We have to, you know, do the blowy thing, as we call it, every Sunday. And every 3 months, we go into Queen's Square, they plug it into computer, and off goes the stats to Switzerland. Well, I've taken a record of these stats, and I know his FVC is going up. Trust me, nothing goes up in DMD, nothing. So, you know, my son is more pessimistic than me, shall we say. He says, no, Mum, I've learnt the technique. I'm thinking, nah, there's something good going on here. I really think. And as I say, it's not an onerous trial to be on. He's 2 tablets 3 times a day, blowy thing once a week. 23 trials, I think, in Europe, about the same. Is it more than 23? How many different trials across Europe for Sidrus?
Yes, yeah.
And there's about the same in the US as well. So, and here's the thing, world data, you collect it all together, and we know we're not rare. And this is a drug that can reach out to other diseases. And I have absolutely high hopes for it. And let this be the start, because you know that any cure, any better treatments of disease is going to be a combination. It's going to be a combination of why Philip at 25 is living well. He's not been on any, you know, silver bullet drugs. He's only been on steroids, ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, preventative. But the thing is, the International Standards of Care document, that's what gives you a better life. And that needs to be across the world. Because I'm telling you, when we went to Rome last weekend, you think because we're in the UK and we're in constant contact with Western Europe, the US, whatever, I met 2 mothers from Ukraine. There's nothing for them there. They are traveling to Israel for treatment. It's, you know, Bosnia, haven't got a clue. I spoke to a mother from India. She's treating Duchenne with homeopathy. Honestly. So we are in a privileged position to have this knowledge. And I think we owe a duty to share that knowledge and to share that expertise. And the number one, when I first found out about Santhera, thinking about this, the first thing I did was get myself on that patient engagement board. And I would also say was, how do the pharmaceuticals find you? They find you from a registry. If you don't get out there and get engaged, and if you haven't got a registry for your disease, well, flipping well, start one. That's what I did. And that's what we continue to do. And all, you know, our registry feeds into Treat DMD, it feeds into Connect, the US registry. It has to be interconnected across the world. Otherwise, we're never going to beat anything. And, you know, patient engagement is now, you know, I remember when we were fighting to get Translarna, which actually only treats a very small subset of Duchenne, 13% with a stop code mutation, a nonsense mutation. And it was just, well, how actually does this regulatory process work? And we found the most ridiculous smoke and mirrors, that these life-changing decisions were made about your disease, your child, behind closed doors with no accountability. So when my son and I, we had an occasion to give evidence for Santhera, at MRHA. And it was like we were rare beasts, patients being ushered into the building. Yeah, everyone came to look at us. Flippin' heck, that shouldn't be happening. And I think that's the way forward, really. Patient engagement. Yes, we as patients can drive what we want, but it's got to be in collaboration with pharmaceuticals. And this is the important thing. You've got to have the payers and the regulators on board, or it's for nothing. And that is the spider web, that you have to knock down all these smoke and mirrors rooms and just insist. That's the only way it happens. Insist. It's my take-home message.